Erling Haaland did not need the World Cup to prove he could score goals. That part was already settled. He had terrified England. He had broken Premier League logic. He had turned Manchester City's attack into something that felt almost unfair. For years, every debate around him sounded the same. Too powerful, too direct, too dependent on service, too quiet in the wrong Champions League nights, too robotic to be romantic. But there was always one silence on his resume, one empty room, one stage where the most feared striker of his generation had never been allowed to stand. The World Cup. And that is where the Haaland story becomes more dangerous. Because club football can make you famous. The Champions League can make you feared. The Premier League can make you rich, decorated, and statistically undeniable. But the World Cup does something colder. It removes the system. It removes the excuses. It asks one question that club football can avoid for years. Can you carry the weight of a country when the whole world is watching? For a long time, Norway looked like the ceiling on Haaland's international legacy. Great player, small nation, wrong passport, wrong era, wrong tournament history. Then the qualifiers came. And Haaland did not just help Norway qualify. He dragged a country out of a 27-year absence, scored 16 goals, destroyed Italy in Milan, and made Pep Guardiola's belief look less like praise and more like diagnosis. The world thought Haaland needed the perfect machine. Norway proved something far more frightening. Maybe Haaland was the machine, and World Cup 2026 is where that truth will finally stand trial. The public misunderstanding around Haaland was never that people thought he was bad. That would be ridiculous. Everyone knew he was extraordinary. Everyone saw the goals. Everyone saw the records. Everyone saw the size, the speed, the violence of his movement, the strange way he could disappear for long stretches and still decide the entire match in one touch. But that was exactly where the misunderstanding began, because people reduced him to the easiest version of the story. They saw Manchester City, they saw Kevin De Bruyne, they saw Pep Guardiola's positional machine, they saw cutbacks, crosses, tap-ins, and defensive lines already broken before Haaland arrived in the frame. So, the argument became comfortable. Of course he scores there. Of course he dominates there. Put a monster striker inside the best structure in football, and the numbers will explode. That surface story was attractive because it sounded intelligent. It made people feel like they were seeing through the hype. It gave critics a way to admire the production while questioning the player. Haaland became less a footballer and more a final action. Less a creator of chaos and more the beneficiary of it. Even his silence worked against him. He was not a traditional playmaking genius. He did not seduce games with constant touches. He did not spend 90 minutes painting patterns across midfield. When Manchester City suffered in certain Champions League nights, people looked at Haaland and asked why the monster had not saved them. But everyone was watching the wrong thing. They were judging him by how often he touched the game. Guardiola was judging him by how deeply the game bent because of him. And Norway would become the place where that difference could no longer be hidden. Pep Guardiola did not need to be told what Haaland was. He saw him every day. He saw the goals, yes, but more importantly, he saw the gravity. The way defenders changed their body shape before the ball even arrived. The way center backs stopped stepping forward because they were terrified of what would happen behind them. The way a striker could distort an entire defensive structure without touching the ball. The public watched the headline. Guardiola watched the structure. That is why his reaction to Norway's qualification mattered. It was not just a manager being happy for his player, it was the clearest public expression of something deeper. Guardiola framed Haaland as a world-class footballer who deserved the World Cup stage, a player at the right age, with the right maturity, finally getting the platform his status demanded. That was not empty celebration. That was recognition. Because Guardiola understood the missing piece. He knew that Haaland's career had already become enormous, but not complete. He had the club goals. He had the domestic dominance. He had the Champions League medal with Manchester City. But international football asks a different question. It does not ask whether your club can build the best machine around you. It asks whether your country can survive the pressure you attract. That is a different burden. And Guardiola, more than most, understands how football history works. He knows that the greatest players are not only measured by what they do in perfect conditions, they are measured by what remains when conditions become imperfect. The world saw noise. He saw the pattern. Haaland was not just chasing another tournament appearance. He was chasing the one stage powerful enough to change the meaning of everything he had already done. The hidden truth is this. For Erling Haaland, the World Cup is not extra credit. It is the missing courtroom. That is the thesis of this story. Not because club football does not matter. It matters enormously. Not because Manchester City made him artificial. They did not. Not because Norway must suddenly become a favorite, or because one tournament can erase years of proof, but because some players become so large that normal measurements stop being enough. Haaland is one of those players. When a striker scores at his rate, the debate changes. It stops being about whether he is elite. It becomes about where his greatness belongs. Is he only the perfect club weapon? Is he a product of elite supply? Is he a statistical giant in an era built for attacking numbers? Or can his football become something older, heavier, and more human? A national memory. That is what World Cups create. Not just winners, not just goals, not just highlights. They create images people carry for the rest of their lives. A country remembers where it was. A generation remembers who made them believe. A player stops being only a club figure and becomes part of national identity. That is the gap Haaland had never been allowed to enter. Norway had lived outside the World Cup for more than a quarter of a century. Haaland had become one of the biggest names in the sport, while his national team remained outside the tournament where football mythology is still written in the loudest ink. That was the contradiction. The most feared striker in Europe had no World Cup story. World Cup 2026 does not need to prove Haaland can score. We already know that. It will ask something sharper. Can his goals become bigger than numbers? Can they become Norway's return to football memory? And that is where the story stops being about talent. It becomes about legacy. At first, it looked like the old story would survive. Norway had stars, but Norway had also had disappointment. That is the part people outside the country often missed. Haaland did not arrive into a nation used to global tournament summers. He arrived into a football culture carrying years of absence, frustration, and almosts. Norway had not reached a World Cup since 1998. That fact mattered because it changed the weight of every qualifier. This was not just another campaign. This was a country trying to reopen a door that had been closed for 27 years. Every Haaland goal was not just a number. It was pressure being converted into proof. That was the first clue. The second clue was harder to ignore. Haaland did not drift through qualifying as a luxury finisher. He consumed it. 16 goals, 8 matches, a goal in every game of Norway's qualifying campaign, according to Reuters. Not one hot night, not one inflated stat line, a full campaign of punishment. That changes the conversation, because the old criticism said Haaland needed Manchester City's machine to feed him. But in Norway's shirt, he was no longer standing inside the most refined attacking structure in club football. He was carrying a national attack with a different kind of responsibility. The spaces were not always perfect. The service was not always city level. The pressure was not distributed across a billion-dollar squad. And still the goals came. Then came Moldova. Norway's 11-1 win was the kind of result people can dismiss if they want to. They can call it a mismatch. They can say elite players should dominate those games. And to a point, that is fair. But Haaland scoring 5 in that match was not the final argument. It was a warning flare. Because in qualification campaigns, serious teams do not only survive the smaller opponents, they remove doubt from those games. They build goal difference. They turn routine nights into pressure on everyone else. Haaland did that. The pattern was becoming clear. This was not a superstar waiting for Norway to become big enough for him. This was a superstar making Norway feel bigger. Then came Italy, and this is where the story changed from impressive to symbolic. San Siro, Milan, Italy, 4-time world champions, a nation that carries World Cup history in its bones even after recent pain. Norway entered that night with a chance to end decades of waiting. Italy entered it under the shadow of another playoff disaster. For a while, the old world pushed back. Italy scored early. Francesco Pio Esposito gave them the lead. The first half suggested that maybe history still had its hand on the match. Maybe Norway's dream would have to bend. Maybe Haaland's campaign would remain brilliant, but unfinished. Then the second half arrived. Antonio Nusa equalized in the 63rd minute. And after that, Haaland did what great strikers do when history leaves 1 inch of space. In the 78th minute, he punished Italy for losing him in the box. A minute later, he scored again. 2 goals. 1 minute. The match flipped from tension to verdict. Jørgen Strand Larsen added the 4th in stoppage time, and Norway walked out of Milan with a 4-1 victory that did more than qualify them. It forced the world to update the story. That was not a friendly, that was not a comfortable home crowd. That was not a club machine serving him chances against a broken opponent. That was Haaland, in Norway colors, on Italian soil, turning a national dream into fact. And the consequence made it even heavier. Norway qualified. Italy went into the playoffs again. That is the brutality of football evidence. One country's release becomes another country's humiliation. One player's legacy door opens while a giant of the game is pushed toward another nightmare. By the end of the campaign, Norway had 8 wins from 8. Perfect, not lucky. Not accidental, not dependent on one dramatic escape. 8 matches, 8 wins, 16 Haaland goals. The old story no longer worked. You could still debate his all-around game. You could still discuss touches, build-up play, Champions League finals, and stylistic preferences. Football allows that. But you could no longer say his international legacy was only a limitation waiting to expose him. He had turned limitation into evidence. And that is why Guardiola's words landed differently. When he said Haaland deserved to experience the World Cup, it sounded like praise. But after the qualifiers, it felt like something closer to a diagnosis of football history. Some players do not just need trophies. They need the right stage for the world to understand the size of their burden. Haaland had the goals. Now he had the stage. And once those two things meet, the story becomes dangerous. World Cup 2026 will not tell us whether Erling Haaland is talented. That question is finished. It will not tell us whether he can score goals. That question is almost insulting now. What World Cup 2026 will tell us is whether Haaland's power can survive the one environment where reputation cannot protect you. The World Cup is not fair. That is why it matters. You do not get a 38-game league season to correct the story. You do not get the same training rhythm. You do not get the same tactical familiarity. You do not get club chemistry built over years. You get a small number of matches, national emotion, strange weather, travel, pressure, and opponents who know that one mistake can define their tournament. For Haaland, that is the test. Not because Norway must win the tournament. That would be the wrong framing. Norway are not entering 2026 as a traditional giant. They are entering as a nation that has been away since 1998, carrying one of the most terrifying strikers in the world, into a tournament that will instantly measure him against the sport's biggest names. That is the pressure, and Group 1 makes it sharper. France brings the superstar comparison. Kylian Mbappe represents the kind of World Cup legacy Haaland has never had the chance to build. France have recent World Cup weight, recent finals experience, and the kind of squad depth that turns every match into a status test. Senegal brings physicality, pride, and tournament danger. Iraq brings the volatility of a team entering the stage with its own national emotion and nothing to lose. So, this is not a simple coronation. It is a trial. World Cup 2026 will ask whether Haaland can transform Norway's return into something more than participation. It will ask whether he can make defenders feel the same fear in a national shirt that they feel when Manchester City control the ball around the box. The question is not whether Haaland belongs at the World Cup. The question is what the World Cup becomes once he arrives. The human cost of this story is easy to miss because Haaland makes goals look mechanical. But there is nothing mechanical about carrying a country. For years, Norway fans watched the world's biggest football summers without their team in them. They watched other nations create memories. They watched other stars become national symbols. They watched the World Cup from the outside, while one of their own became a global superstar at club level. That creates a strange kind of pain, pride and absence at the same time. Haaland could dominate England on Saturday, and Norway could still feel far from the center of football's biggest stage. He could break records for Manchester City, and the national question would still remain unanswered. Now that changes. And with that change comes pressure, because when a country waits 27 years, qualification is not just relief. It becomes expectation. It becomes a demand for meaning. Fans do not only want to be present, they want to feel that the waiting mattered. That falls on Haaland. Not alone, because Norway are more than one player. Martin Odegaard, Alexander Sorloth, Antonio Nusa, Oscar Bob, and others give this team layers. But emotionally, Haaland is the face of the return. He is the image the world will use. He is the name on the preview. He is the striker defenders will circle, and that can be lonely, because if Norway fail, the old arguments will return quickly. Wrong passport, club system player, great scorer, limited legacy, too dependent, too quiet when the stage changed. That is the cost. Not just losing a match, losing control of the story. And for a player like Haaland, the story is now almost as heavy as the goals. So, was Guardiola right about Haaland? Yes. But not in the simple way. He was not just right that Haaland deserved to play in a World Cup. That part is obvious now. A world-class player at his age with his record in his physical prime belongs on the biggest football stage. Guardiola was right about something deeper. He understood that Haaland's career had outgrown ordinary proof. The goals were no longer enough by themselves. The trophies were not enough by themselves. The Premier League debates were too small. The Champions League arguments were too narrow. The tap-in criticism was too lazy. The club system label was too comfortable. Haaland needed a stage where the question could become national. Norway gave him that. 16 qualifying goals gave him that. Milan gave him that. Italy gave him that. A 27-year absence gave him that. Now World Cup 2026 will decide how far the story goes. Not whether Haaland is great. Greatness is already on the table. The real question is whether his greatness can become memory, because there is a difference between a striker who scores everywhere and a striker who changes what a country believes is possible. That is the line Haaland is walking now. The world judged him like a club weapon. Guardiola saw the missing stage. Norway opened the door. And now, football has prepared the courtroom. So, here is the question. If Haaland scores at World Cup 2026 and Norway become more than just a nice return story, does that change the way you rank him among this generation's great players? Or is club football still the real measurement? Drop your answer in the comments, because this debate is only going to get louder once Norway step onto that stage. And if this story is about a superstar finally reaching the World Cup stage he was missing, the next one is even stranger. Because sometimes football does not expose a player. It exposes everyone who misunderstood him.